Hi everyone, this is Arcadius and welcome back to Naval Creed. Today we'll be going over the stats clash for Tier 2 cruisers. And so that includes Katori, Chester, Dresden, Yatsen, Weymouth, and Aurora as the current Tier 2 or matchmaking Tier 2 cruisers in the game right now. But before that, we do have a little bit more information to go over in regards to Tier 1 cruisers and Tier 2 destroyers. Like I said, this series, our video series, is still a work in progress. So I did take some things out in the last video, and I also I didn't really forget, but I was struggling to figure out how to go over another portion of information, which I think I have at least the basis started for that. So let's just go over that information before we go into our information for today. So first things first, we're going to go over the consumables for Tier 1 cruisers. Now, all they have is a damage control party, which like repairs fires and floodings and damaged modules. But there is specific parts of it that are very interesting. So the Japanese cruisers Hashidate and Kotori, their damage control party only lasts 5 seconds. It's unlimited and it has a 60-second cooldown. Erie and Broomer have a 10-second duration damage control party. Everything else is the same. And then Black Swan actually has a 15-second damage control party duration. And the rest is the same. Black Swan also gets a heal. It gets 2 heals. They last for 30 seconds and they have a cooldown of 90 seconds. So if you remember from going back over the Tier 1 stats, Black Swan didn't really have a lot in terms of health and armor and all that. But she does have it in survivability. She can repair the damage that she receives, or at least part of it. And then her damage control party can help extinguish fires and floodings for a lot longer time. And it's impossible for you to get a flooding or fire or anything damaged during the time that that damage control party is active. So that kind of gives you a limited amount of invulnerability. You'll still take damage, but you won't actually have damage like fires or floodings or anything like that. So that's kind of interesting there. The same thing with Tier 2 destroyers. This time we have 3 consumables that we can use. So for damage control party, they are all exactly the same for Tachibana, Wakatake, Samson, and Novik. However, for the smoke screen, they have a smoke generator. Tachibana and Wakatane's, the smoke only lasts for 20 seconds. Samson lasts for 30 seconds. And for Novik, it lasts 35 seconds. And it has the same amount of cooldown and number of charges. And then we have a speed boost duration. So this increases your speed by 10%, your base speed by 10%. So it does differ between all of the ships overall. Tachibana Wakatake can speed boost for 90 seconds with a cooldown of 60 and 4 charges, while Samson and Novik can only speed boost for 81 seconds with a cooldown of 60 seconds and 4 charges. So the Japanese destroyers may have worse smoke screens, but they have better speed boosts, and the American and Soviet destroyer has the opposite. They have better smoke screens and somewhat worse speed boost, but Novik itself is still faster than any other ship in terms of destroyers, so yeah, it doesn't really have a problem there. Next, we're going to go over the number of shells and the number of possible fires for the Tier 2 destroyers. So this was part of the information that I actually removed when I finished my Tier 1 cruiser review, but I feel like it's important enough that I need to add it. So for Tachibana, Wakatake, Samson, and Novik, the maximum number of shells that Tachibana can send out is 48 shells, which is the most of any Tier 2 destroyer, but they're only 3-inch guns, so they're not necessarily the best. Wakatake can do the smallest number of only 18 shells in a minute. Samson has 24, and then Novik has a pretty decent 40 shells per minute, and we already know how good those guns are. Number of fires is not exactly spectacular. The Japanese and American destroyers can only have a maximum of 1 fire per minute, and the Novik can have a maximum of 2 fires a minute. So again, nothing spectacular, but if you shoot different targets, you have the ability to set more than 1 fire. It really depends on RNG, But just looking at the numbers itself, this is what you can expect, I would say. And with that, that does wrap up the, I guess you could say, review of other information for Tier 1 and Tier 2 cruisers and destroyers, respectively. And now we will be going into new material for Tier 2 cruisers. And those cruisers, as mentioned, are Gatori, Chester, Dresden, Yeltsin, Weymouth, and Aurora. And I did mention this a little bit in the last video, but you will see that Aurora is going to be one of the strongest ships of this tier. If not the strongest, depending on what your playstyle is. But there's also a very close competitor in the form of Weymouth. So we're going to take a look at those in a minute. Alright, so to start out, we're looking at general stats. Health-wise, Aurora has the most at 19,200 health points, and Yeltsin has the smallest at 16,500. And then it just kind of goes in between, with Katori, Chester, Dresden, and Weymouth somewhere in between there. So nothing necessarily too different about that. It's only about 3,000 health difference, which is pretty much just one salvo. But it does actually become quite important. Torpedo damage resistance, so how much damage your hull immediately deflects when a torpedo makes contact. Only Aurora has a torpedo damage resistance of 10%. All the other ships do not. So right off the bat, we see that Aurora has a lot of health and even has torpedo damage resistance. All right, well, what about belt armor? So Katori only has 10 millimeters, Chester has 38 millimeters, Dresden has 80 millimeters, which is over 3 inches, which is the best at this tier. Yeltsin has 12, Weymouth has 10, and Aurora doesn't actually have a belt armor listed in game right now, but the maximum armor that she has is 70 millimeters, and it does not look like that is on the guns itself, so I'm going to assume that is the belt armor. However, it could very well be different. However, even if it is 70 millimeters, it's still not more than Dresden at 80 millimeters. So Dresden has the best belt armor at this tier. And honestly, that you do see that in game. It will actually shatter quite a few high explosive shells, and armor piercing can citadel it, I should say. But most of the time it does just overpen or even just normally pen. It's really hard to understand what to do when you're shooting this ship, especially if you're in a destroyer. High explosive is just going to shatter. Your armor piercing is just going to ricochet probably or overpen. Same with cruisers, battleships even. Your high explosive shells really can't pen through that, and your armor piercings are just too big for it. They just go right through the ship. I find it's just best to use high explosive and burn the ship, trying to aim for the superstructure, but that's just me. Turning circle radius. So how long does it, or how wide of a circle does your ship make when it turns around? Yeltsin is obviously going to be the smallest at 340 because it's such a small ship. It's the second smallest, or one of the smallest ships in the game. 037, the special ship, is actually the smallest in the game currently. And then we see that Aurora actually has the worst at 600, so almost twice the distance of Yeltsin. But you don't really see that in game. Aurora's, I haven't had a problem with her at all. Speed. So how fast does the ship go? Weymouth and Dresden are the fastest at this tier at 25 knots, with Chester coming in close at 24 knots. And then Yeltsin, Katori, and Aurora are all pretty much the same at about 20 knots or so, but Aurora is actually the slowest at 18.8 knots. All right, that brings us to surface detectability. It's not as important with cruisers as it is in destroyers, but it is still pretty decent to at least know which ones are the most stealthiest and which ones have the worst stealthiest. Further along the lines in the higher tiers, when you're doing like arena battles, you really want to pay attention to everything that your ship has. So knowing that early, it'll make you have a good habit. So for surface detectability, Weymouth actually has the worst at 11.8 kilometers, with Yeltsin having the smallest at 6.4 kilometers, which is almost half of Weymouth. And then, yeah, it's pretty much, you have Katori is the worst at or second worst, I should say, at 10.9. And then it just goes down with Chester at 8.4, Dresden 9.5, and Aurora at 9.8. And then air detectability, you're not going to see much aircraft here. Again, you're really only going to see a Katori float plane. You might see a couple carriers if you're really, really bad matchmaking game. But most of the time, you're not going to see any aircraft. But if you do, Yatsen, again, is the best concealment at 4.3 air detectability kilometers, with Dresden actually being a close match at 4.5 kilometers. Chester at 4.9, Weymouth at 5.3, Katori at 5.4, and Aurora having the worst at 5.6. But Aurora is a big cruiser, so it doesn't really surprise me. So that finalizes the general stats here. So Aurora has a lot of good health, same with Weymouth. Aurora and Dresden have good armor. Aurora actually has bad maneuverability and speed. And then you have Dresden, which is pretty decent as well. And then detectability-wise, Weymouth is the worst. On surface-wise, Yatsen is the best. And then similar stats all throughout. So there we go. Let's move on to the guns now. All right, so the guns. Katori has 140mm guns, which is about 4.5 or so, I think. Chester has 6-inch guns. Dresden has 4. And then Yatsen, Weymouth, and Aurora all have 6-inch guns as well. Now, 180-degree turn time. Now, take this information with a grain of salt. And what I mean by that is Katori and Yatsen are really the only ships that need to focus at this number, because like Dresden, Weymouth, and Aurora, all their ships are side-mounted guns, so they can't actually turn 180 degrees. So if you turn from right to left, you already have all your guns set to fire at that target immediately. They don't need to rotate. So where it does count is Katori, which rotates in 15 seconds, Yatsen, which rotates in 18, Weymouth, Aurora, and Chester all have guns that can rotate 180 degrees, mainly on the fore and aft mounted weaponry. But there's only like 1 or 2 there, so it doesn't really matter. But yeah, Katori would be best in regards to 180-degree turn time, Yatsen being the worst. Rate of fire. Katori has 10 rounds a minute, Chester has 9 rounds a minute, Dresden has 15 rounds a minute, Yatsen has 10, Weymouth has 12, and Aurora has 10 as well. Or 6, I should say. So in seconds, that's 6-second reload for Katori, 6.6-second reload for Chester, 4-second reload for Dresden, 6-second reload for Yatsen, 12-second reload for Weymouth, and 10-second reload for Aurora. So Weymouth does have the worst reload out of all of these, but she is actually still pretty powerful and she can hold her own weight. If you also take a look at Aurora with 10 rounds a minute, that's also pretty decent. So you can see the two powerhouses in terms of gun power already are Weymouth and Aurora. Though Dresden does have her fair share of having good weaponry with 4-second reload, that's definitely a good thing there. All right, high explosive damage. Dresden has the least with her 4-inch guns at 1600 only. And Weymouth actually has the most at 3,100 per shell. And then you have Aurora, Chester, and Katori all being around 23, 24, 2,500. Same with Yatsen. And then, yeah, like I said, Dresden has the last at 1,600. High explosive fire chance. Aurora has the best chance of setting a fire at 9.6%, and Dresden has the least amount of chance of setting a fire at 6.1%. But that is going to be a common thing with all German cruisers, I would say. They're not really known for setting fires all that often. High explosive piercing, so how many millimeters of armor can your high explosive shells go through? They're all pretty much 30 millimeters, except Katori, which is only 28, and Dresden, which is only 20. But again, that's because she has 4-inch guns. High explosive velocity, how fast does your shell travel after it leaves the barrel? Weymouth has the fastest shell velocity of high explosive at 894 meters per second, with Katori being second at 850 meters per second, and then Dresden having the worst at 690 meters per second as well. And so that brings us to armor piercing in a moment. But yeah, you can clearly see the difference between 890 and 690 between Weymouth and Dresden. That's 200 meters per second difference. It's a pretty substantial amount. And it does really show. Dresden shells tend to just arc really, really high, and Weymouth shells tend to just head straight toward the target on a beeline. Armor piercing. So it looks like Dresden has the least again at 2100, but not by much, because since Katori only has 2200, and Chester and Yatsen only have 2400, but Weymouth has 3000 and Aurora has 3300 damage per armor piercing shell hit. Armor piercing velocity, same kind of story. Weymouth has the fastest shells at 894, and Dresden has the slowest at 690. I don't actually think, well, yeah, it looks like there's only one ship that has a difference between high explosive and armor piercing shell velocity. That's Aurora. Aurora's high explosive shells travel slower at 753, and armor piercing shells travel at 792. All right, so what does that mean in terms of broadside? So the number of shells that each of these ships can fire on a broadside during 1 minute, Katori can fire 40 shells in 1 minute and have a maximum of 2 fires. Chester can fire 27 shells since she only has a 3-gun broadside, and she can set 2 fires possible. Dresden can set or fire 90 shells from one side only and set 5 fires. Yatsen can fire 20 shells and set 1 fire. Weymouth can fire 25 shells and set 2 fires. And Aurora can fire 48 shells and set 4 fires. So Dresden and Aurora are going to be your go-to ships if you're looking for a fire starter. And honestly, both of these are extremely good in that role. They all have a lot of guns on each broadside. So Katori has 4 guns on a broadside, Chester has 3, Dresden has 6, Yatsen has 2, Weymouth has 5, and Aurora has 8. So you can automatically see that Dresden and Aurora are definitely going to have a lot of good damage. The only reason why Weymouth isn't really up there with the number of shells is because she has a very long reload of 12 seconds. So that does make it a bit difficult. High explosive damage alpha. So how much damage can all of your shells on one broadside do if they all hit the target? So Aurora has the most high explosive alpha of 20,000 damage if all 8 high explosive shells hit and do maximum damage. And then it kind of goes down to Weymouth at 15.5. Dresden and Katori are pretty close, about 92 and 96. And then lastly, we have Chester and Yatsen at about 7,200. So not really a lot there. And in fact, it actually looks like I have a mistake because I counted for 3 guns on Yatsen when it only has 2. So she only actually has an HE alpha of 4,800. So that would make her the lowest, which is self-explanatory considering she only has 2 6-inch guns. You still have the possibility of going up Aurora, which has 8 6-inch guns per broadside. So yeah, definitely gonna lose that gunfight there. In terms of armor piercing, again, Aurora has the strongest at 26,400 maximum on damage if all 8 shells do maximum damage. Weymouth is at 15,000. Dresden actually has a pretty decent amount of 12,600. Then Katori has 8,800, Chester has 7,200, and then again, a typo, Yatsen has only 4,800 maximum damage it can inflict. So again, clearly you can see that Weymouth and Aurora are definitely going to be your damage dealers in terms of cruisers. This brings us to gun ranges themselves. So the red line indicates main gun range, and then blue line indicates secondary gun range, since 3 of these cruisers actually have secondaries, and we'll go over those in a minute. But for right now, Weymouth has the longest range at 11.6 kilometers, with Katori coming in close second at 11.2, and Dresden at 11. And then we have Aurora at 9.9 kilometers, Yatsen at 9.6, and then lastly Chester at 9.2 kilometers. So between Weymouth and Chester, that's almost a 2.5 kilometer difference, which at tier 2 is a lot considering it's very close quarters fighting. And if you can be shot at without being shot yourself, if you can shoot the enemy without being shot at yourself, that does definitely give you an advantage over the enemy. Secondaries, not really that impressive. Katori has a twin 127 millimeter secondary on the stern that can fire out to 4.2 kilometers. Chester has 4 single 3-inch arranged in each of the corners, I guess you could say, or quarters of the ship. They fire out to 3.3. And Weymouth has a couple small secondaries amidships, 2 on each side, and they can fire out to 4 kilometers. Nothing really to write home about except for Katori secondary. It is somewhat decent when she's tossed into tier 1 games, and you focus on actual tier 1 cruisers. But when you're moved to tier 2, it's kind of questionable. It might be okay against destroyers, but it'll take some time to actually work them over. At best, you might get a couple extra fires from your secondary. Speaking about secondaries, here we are. So Katori, Chester, and Weymouth are the only ones that have secondaries here. On the broadside, all of them only have 2 barrels. Katori has 127s, Chester has 76 or 3-inch, and then Weymouth actually has 47 mil, so it's practically worthless. But they all fire high explosive as well. So again, there's the chance to do a little bit of damage against lightly armored targets, such as destroyers, and also the possibility of setting another fire. Alright, this brings us to anti-aircraft defense. Not really that substantial at this tier. Katori has 5 guns with a max damage of 9, max range of 5 kilometers. Chester actually has an AA gun, but there's no stats for it at all, so it doesn't do anything. She has no AA defense at all. Dresden has 4 damage at 1 kilometer, so again, practically worthless, if not completely worthless. Yatsen is actually kind of interesting in the fact that she has 14 DPS for her AA at a max range of 4 kilometers. I've actually started making her into an AA cruiser with a captain skill. That's why you see my mistake here, because I actually have her out to 4.4 and 3.3 for AA right now instead of 4 and 3. Weymouth has practically nothing at 5 DPS, but it does go out to 3 kilometers. And then Aurora, she couldn't just let Yatsen have the glory of having the strongest AA. She also has to have 14 DPS, but it only goes out to about 1.2 kilometers. So again, nothing really impressive about any of this anti-aircraft weaponry, except Yatsen, which can do 10 DPS at 4 km. I have shot down a couple planes when I've been tossed with Katoris, but honestly, it's not worth it. That brings us to torpedoes. So there's only 2 cruisers at tier 2 that have torpedoes. One is Katori, which we've gone over before, but we now also have Weymouth. So Katori's torpedoes, they go out to 6 kilometers, have a speed of 57 knots, rate of fire of 1.5 rounds a minute, which is about 40 seconds. One single torp damage does 6,400 damage, but it's a twin launcher, so it does 12,800 per launcher, and you have 1 on each side, so that's 12,800 for a broadside damage. Flood chance of 56.65%, and a detectability of 1.7 kilometers. Pretty standard, nothing too exciting. However, Weymouth has a 10-kilometer torpedo. 10-kilometer torpedo, which is almost the same as its gun range, which is 11.6. It can actually out-torpedo 3 cruisers. If we go back to the gun range, Aurora, Yatsen, and Chester all have main gun ranges less than 10 kilometers. So the torpedo range on this is about farther than them. However, the drawback is that it's only a 30-knot torpedo. There's literally some destroyers that can go faster than that. Rate of fire is 1.33 rounds a minute, or about 45.1 second reload. But the damage is 17,100. And you have 1 underwater launcher on each side. You can only fire to the side. You can't fire 4, and you can't fire behind you. So, yeah, you only have 1 torpedo per side. But the flood chance is 151.37%, and the detectability is only 1.1 kilometer. The best way I found to use this torpedo is not to use its range, because if you fire it from range, you have a very high chance of inflicting friendly fire considering its slow speed. And also your accuracy is going to drop down considerably the farther away you are because of, again, its slow speed. So I like to rush right up to the targets, mainly battleships, and just hand deliver the torpedo from a couple hundred meters away, and that way I don't have to worry about its slow speed or friendly fire, because it's always going to be hit if I'm right next to the ship. When compared to other torpedoes in regards to the destroyers, so if we went broadside with another ship at this tier and fired all of our torpedoes into the side of it, would it sink it? For Katori, she only has the torpedo firepower to sink a destroyer on the broadside. She doesn't even have the firepower to sink a Yatsen with 2 torpedoes. It would survive on about 4,000 health or so, less. So Katori only has the torpedo firepower to sink a destroyer one-on-one. And then it looks like Katori or Weymouth has the ability to actually sink Yatsen and Dresden, but nothing else. So it has a little bit more firepower behind it, and actually has exact amount of damage that Dresden needs to be sunk at 17,100. So that's interesting right there. So Weymouth has a little bit better torpedo, but Katori is also not that far behind. And honestly, Katori can just whip around and fire 2 more, but Weymouth can only fire 1 more if you turn her around. So it still shows that Weymouth has better torpedoes, but again, the speed is a really determining factor, and the ship itself, you don't really want to get close to it. She can be citadeled with high explosive, so you really want to stay at range anyways. And that brings us to consumables. So Katori has a 5-second damage control party that has a cooldown of 60 seconds, unlimited charges. Chester and Dresden both have a 10-second damage control party duration, 60-second cooldown, unlimited charges. Yatsen and Weymouth both have 15-second damage control party durations, 60-second reload, or cooldown I should say, and unlimited charges. Weymouth also has 2 charges of a heal that lasts 30 seconds with a cooldown of 90 seconds, and Aurora has a 5-second damage control party duration with a cooldown of 60 seconds and unlimited charges. So just as a review, Katori has pretty okay guns. She has a little bit of everything. She has a fighter, she has torpedoes, she has a secondary. Pretty slow speed though, nothing to write home about. Chester is absolute junk. You don't actually have to buy this ship. I'm pretty sure you just have to buy her for credits and you can get her for free. Besides the credits. But honestly, she's just going to take up a port slot and she's not going to be worth your time. So if you don't have this ship, then don't buy her. I assure you, you're not missing anything. Dresden, pretty decent fire starter. Like I said, she has the trolley armor that you don't really know how to use, or shoot at, I should say. High explosive shatters and armor piercing just overpens. And while you're doing that, she's shooting at you with 6 guns per side at 4 seconds and sending 90 shells your way each minute. I've done a lot of good damage with fires on her. I've had a game where I went up against like 10 battleships or something like that. I had a ton of fires, but the fires did the damage for me, considering my guns didn't really do much on the broadside. In terms of high explosive or armor piercing, you definitely want to try and go for the fire damage with this ship. But do remember that your shells are the slowest, so it will take some time to get to the target. Yatsen, not really worth a purchase. Like I said, she was one of those pack ships that came out for diamonds. I don't think she's available, will ever be available again. So there's that, but you're not really missing out on much. She only has 2 guns. She has decent AA, but again, at this tier, it doesn't really mean anything. But she has good turning circle and detectability, so she's kind of a stealthy kind of ship, but still kind of questionable. Weymouth, really, really strong guns on the side. You even have a heal to repair some of the damage. But yeah, I mean, the ship can be citadeled by high explosive. but you still want to stay at range, but then you have torpedoes that are pretty worthless at range, which makes you kind of want to get close. But definitely not a bad ship. And then Aurora, as you can kind of see from the stats, is a very, very strong ship. She has a ton of guns on the side. If you actually count them, she has about 4 Yachtons per side, in terms of 8 guns versus 2. And she also has the most health. She even has torpedo damage resistance. She matches Yachton for the most AA at this tier. Her gun range isn't actually that far and only 9.9, but it's definitely not that much difference from 11.6 either. And the amount of damage she can dish out is just amazing. High explosive or armor piercing. And then her speed is kind of slow, and her maneuverability and rudder circle is kind of trash. But like I said, it doesn't really matter at this tier all that much. I would think that this ship is probably as strong as one of the battleships at this tier, honestly, and if not even stronger, considering her rate of fire. So, yeah, Weymouth and Aurora kind of are the better ships at this tier, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the others are bad. They're just not as powerful, except Chester. Chester's bad. Don't play Chester. With that, I will wrap up today's video. If you liked the video, make sure you like and subscribe. And join me tomorrow while we go over the newest diamond ship, I guess you could say. It's another diamond pack, and that is another Pan-Asian pack, and it's for the cruiser Ninghai. So thank you again, and take care.